The crimson dress lay in the dust, a mockery of what it had been, torn into jagged strips as if dragged through a field of razor wire. Ilara knelt on one knee, a rough, faded gray blanket clutched desperately around her shivering body. Her face, usually so warm with the scent of fresh bread, was a pale mask, her breathing shallow and ragged. Yet, her eyes, those remarkable eyes, the color of deep moss after a rain, were locked straight ahead, burning with something far deeper than mere fear. It was the indelible mark of someone who understood, with chilling clarity, that the world had just ripped away something it had no earthly right to claim. Moments before, the summer sun over Whisper Gulch had been a brutal, unrelenting forge, so intense you could practically hear bacon sizzling on a forgotten shovel. The air itself shimmered, a distorted mirage above the baked earth, thick with the pungent, earthy scent of horse sweat, dry dust, and the distant metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge. The marketplace, usually the bustling heart of Whisper Gulch, pulsed with a vibrant, low hum of small-town life. Boots scuffed against weathered wooden porches, the rhythmic creak of wagon wheels punctuated the chatter, and the clinking of coins, deals being struck over sacks of golden grain and fresh-picked produce. It was a familiar, comforting symphony until three riders materialized at the edge of town. Their approach was announced not by shouts, but by the sinister jingling of spurs with each deliberate step, the ominous clopping of hooves on packed earth, and the fine film of trail dust clinging to their worn coats, their hats pulled low, obscuring their eyes. Nobody in Whisper Gulch needed an introduction. The very air seemed to thicken, the marketplace sounds dying abruptly as folks simply went quiet, as if the very breath of life had been abruptly sucked from the street. Children, mid-chase, froze like startled deer. Dogs that had been napping in the shade lifted their heads, a low growl rumbling in their chests before their masters yanked them back. Ilara, proprietress of the Sweet Loaf Bakery, had stood before them with a quiet dignity, her chin held high, her voice, though strained, remarkably steady. She had asked for just a few more days to gather the protection money. Business at her little bakery, a legacy from her late husband, had been painfully slow, a struggle against mounting debts and a dwindling stream of customers. She clung to the fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, reason could prevail over the brutal, unthinking cruelty these men embodied. The lead rider, a hulking brute with a scarred cheek and eyes like cold flint, didn't argue. He merely grinned, a wolfish baring of teeth that held no mirth. Then, with a casual, practiced ease that spoke of countless such acts, he swung down from his saddle. He moved with a predatory grace, grabbing Ilara's arm with such force that she gasped, a sharp, choked sound. Then, in the middle of the street, under the unforgiving gaze of the high sun, in front of God and everyone, they ripped her dress wide open. The sound of tearing fabric, coarse and visceral, sliced through the stifling heat like a whip crack. It echoed in the sudden agonizing silence of Whisper Gulch, a raw, brutal violation. Sheriff Barnaby, an old man whose badge seemed to weigh heavy on his sagging chest, was there. His hand, gnarled and trembling, rested on the worn butt of his revolver. But it just stayed there, a silent testament to his helplessness, never drawing. Around him, the men of Whisper Gulch stood rooted to the spot, their knuckles white where they gripped tools or clenched fists at their sides, their eyes narrowed but dead. Each one remembered the cost, the horrific price of standing up against these men. Barns torched in the dead of night, the pitiful bleating of cattle shot dead in the pasture, the haunting image of brothers and sons laid out in rough pine boxes. The three riders, their cruel laughter ringing loud and clear, mounted up, tossing the torn crimson fabric onto the ground as if it were nothing but refuse. Their horses' hooves beat a slow, deliberate rhythm down the dusty street, a retreating echo of terror, until there was nothing left but the soft, mournful creak of a swinging saloon door. Ilara stood alone in the blistering sun, gathering the tatters of her dignity, along with the shredded remains of her dress. The dust, disturbed by the horses, settled slowly around her, a fine, gritty shroud. Somewhere in that silent, shamefaced crowd, a man, a lonely rancher named Caleb, had made a quiet, profound decision. This, he vowed, would be the last time Whisper Gulch looked the other way. If you've ever felt the sting of injustice or the quiet despair of a community slowly losing its soul, then you know this isn't just a story. It's a reckoning. Stick around, because what happens next isn't just about revenge. It's about the fiery rebirth of a town and the courage found in unexpected places. You won't want to miss a single dust-choked moment of this journey. Caleb was there that day, though not in the street when it happened. He'd been hauling feed back from his ranch, Stone Creek, nestled on the desolate, quiet edge of town. It was the kind of hot, dusty ride that left a man's shirt plastered to his back, a fine layer of grit embedded in his skin. The sun beat down on the wide, empty plains surrounding his solitary homestead, where the only sounds were the wind whispering through the sagebrush and the occasional mournful cry of a distant hawk. By the time he heard the frantic whispers and saw the crowd breaking apart, dispersing like frightened minnows, Ilara was already gone. A knot of cold dread tightened in his gut. He stopped his wagon by the livery, the horses blowing hard, and asked a stable hand what had transpired. The boy, barely more than a stripling, couldn't even look him in the eye, his gaze fixed on the churned dust where the riders had been. He just muttered, "The riders. They did something bad to Mrs. Hayes," before turning away, hunching his shoulders as if to escape the memory. Caleb felt it then, that slow, heavy burn in his chest, a familiar ache that had been his constant companion for the past 5 years. He'd seen plenty of hard times in his 40-odd years: drought, rustlers, the relentless grind of ranching life. But nothing had ever quite dulled the piercing, hollow echo of his deepest loss. 5 years back, fever had taken his wife Sarah, a vibrant woman with laughter in her eyes and kindness in her touch. He'd buried her himself, beneath the lone, gnarled cottonwood tree that stood sentinel on a rise overlooking his ranch, its ancient branches like arthritic fingers reaching for the sky. Since then, he'd kept to himself, a solitary figure working his cattle, mending fences that always seemed to crumble, and steadfastly staying clear of other folks' business. His ranch, once a place of shared dreams, had become a fortress of solitude. But Ilara wasn't just other folks. He'd been stopping by her bakery for months, always telling himself it was just for the fresh-baked sourdough or the occasional apple turnover that reminded him faintly of Sarah's kitchen. But the truth, a quiet, insistent truth he'd deliberately ignored, was that he'd been drawn to her quiet strength, her resilient spirit. He admired the way she smiled, a genuine, warm curve of her lips, even when the days were long and the customers were scarce. The way her eyes, though often shadowed with fatigue, still held a spark of life. And now, someone had taken that smile, that spark, and tried to grind it into the unforgiving dirt of Whisper Gulch. The thought festered, a bitter coal in his chest. That night, sleep was an impossible luxury. Caleb sat on his porch, the worn wood cool beneath his calloused hands, listening to the incessant chirping of crickets, a lonely symphony in the vast darkness. He stared at the dark, jagged outline of Whisper Gulch under the cold, indifferent moonlight, a town that seemed to shrink under the weight of its own fear. In a place where law was little more than a whispered word, a broken promise, and fear was the true, silent sheriff, decent people had learned to survive by keeping their heads down, by averting their eyes, by becoming invisible. It was a strategy for survival, yes, but it corroded the soul. But deep down, in that quiet, honest place he rarely visited, Caleb knew something else, a hard, undeniable truth. If a man or a town kept looking away long enough, one day there would be nothing left worth looking at. The thought settled heavily, like a stone in his gut. It wasn't just Ilara's humiliation that gnawed at him. It was the slow, agonizing death of decency itself in Whisper Gulch. He pictured the empty streets, the shuttered shops, the fearful faces. Was this the legacy he wanted for a place that, despite its hardships, was home? Was this the legacy for his lost Sarah, who had always believed in justice and kindness, even in the harshest of lands? By sunrise, a pale, anemic light struggling to pierce the eastern horizon, he'd made up his mind. His decision wasn't about heroics, he told himself. He wasn't some storybook knight in shining armor, and it surely wasn't about revenge alone, though a potent, fiery anger simmered just beneath the surface. No, this was about the kind of place Whisper Gulch would become when the next generation came along, when the children who had hidden in doorways grew up. Would they inherit a town cowering in fear, or one that remembered its backbone? And it was, unequivocally, about Ilara, about what a man was willing to risk, what lines he was willing to cross, when he finally decided he'd had enough. He thought of her bowed head, the torn fabric, the silent tears he knew she must have shed later. It spurred him on, hardening his resolve. It happened a week later. The morning air was already warm, that insidious dry heat that promised a blistering, suffocating afternoon. Dust devils swirled lazily in the distance, testament to the parched earth. Folks were setting up their stalls in the marketplace, a hesitant return to the rhythm of commerce. The sound of crates being dropped onto the hard ground, the creaking protest of wagon wheels, and the low murmur of cautious conversation filled the street once more. A fragile sense of normalcy had tentatively reasserted itself. That's when the two riders rode in, not the whole gang, just a pair. But their arrogant swagger, the way they held themselves in their saddles, spoke volumes. Their confident expressions declared without a single word that two was plenty, more than enough to cow this town. They went about their grim business with an air of absolute ownership, stopping at each merchant's stall, their eyes scanning the meager offerings with disdain. They took coins, sometimes more, their hands dipping into pockets without a hint of question or apology. Fear, a cold, familiar pall, began to descend once more over Whisper Gulch. Merchants averted their eyes, clutching their meager earnings, hoping to avoid notice. When they reached a young woman named Lily, barely out of her teens, who was nervously arranging a small basket of fresh eggs, one of the riders dismounted. He grabbed her by the chin, his fingers rough, forcing her head up. He leaned in too close, his breath stale, a predatory grin splitting his face like a wolf eyeing a lamb. Lily visibly flinched, her eyes wide with terror. A collective sigh of suppressed dread rippled through the onlookers. This was the moment. This was the test. That's when Caleb stepped out from the narrow alleyway between the general store and the livery. He didn't shout, didn't run, didn't even quicken his pace. He just walked, slow and steady, his boots thudding softly in the dust, each step a deliberate, resonant statement. The sunlight caught the glint of the rifle he carried, casually held in one hand, its barrel pointing towards the ground. "Let her go," he said. His voice was not loud, not a shout, but it was low, imbued with a quiet power that cut through the marketplace chatter like a finely honed blade. It was a voice that commanded attention, a voice that made folks stop what they were doing, made them turn, made them hold their breath. The rider holding Lily paused, his grin faltering. The other rider, still on his horse, laughed, a harsh, derisive sound that grated on the ears, but the laugh was cut abruptly short. Before he could even finish the last syllable, Caleb's fist connected with the first rider's jaw. It was a clean, brutal hit, the sound a dull thud, delivered with the coiled strength of a man who worked the land and knew how to exert force. The man crumpled, sprawling ungracefully in the dirt, a cloud of dust puffing up around him. The second man, shocked into action, instinctively reached for the gun at his hip, his hand a blur. But before his fingers could even close around the cold steel of the revolver butt, an older voice, steady and resonant, rang out from behind a stack of crates. "Not today," it said. It was Silas, Ilara's father, a man whose shoulders had stooped with age and grief, but whose eyes still held a fierce, unyielding light. He stood behind a weathered barrel, a well-maintained rifle pointed dead steady, its iron sight perfectly aligned with the rider's chest. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, not fear, but possibility. That was all it took. that single act of defiance, that one resolute stand. It was a spark igniting tinder that had been gathering for too long. A few others, galvanized by Caleb's courage and Silas's unwavering aim, began to step forward. First, old Jedediah, the blacksmith, a man of immense strength, emerged from the shadows of his forge, a heavy hammer, still warm from his work, gripped firmly in his hand like a weapon. Then came Martha, the stout general store owner, her face grim, clutching a heavy iron skillet. Farmers, their hands accustomed to plow handles, picked up pitchforks. Merchants, their eyes no longer downcast, reached for anything that could serve as a club or a shield. Even Mrs. Gable, the seamstress, a frail woman prone to fainting, brandished a pair of formidable sewing shears. The tide, slowly, imperceptibly at first, had begun to turn. The two riders, one still dazed in the dirt, the other staring down the barrel of Silas's rifle, looked around. Their eyes, once arrogant and contemptuous, now registered a flicker of something akin to surprise, then grudging recognition. The faces staring back at them were no longer those of cowering victims, but of people who had been pushed too far, whose patience had finally snapped. They quickly realized they weren't paid enough to die in Whisper Gulch, not for a few paltry coins. With a curse, the dazed rider scrambled to his feet. They mounted up, their movements less swaggering, more hasty, and rode out, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that seemed to mock their hurried retreat. The street, moments before choked with fear, was now buzzing with a different kind of energy, a vibrant hum the town hadn't felt in years. It was a heady mix of relief, disbelief, and a thrilling, intoxicating sense of nascent power. But if the riders thought that was the end of it, if they believed this was merely a temporary surge of defiance, they had no idea what truly was coming next. Caleb looked at the faces around him, his own expression unreadable, though a quiet satisfaction bloomed in his chest. These were people who had been quiet for too long, their voices silenced by fear, their spirits slowly crushed under the weight of oppression. People who, until this very moment, had been content to survive by keeping their heads down. But now, in the aftermath of their collective stand, they were ready to talk, to plan, to fight. A sense of community, long dormant, sparked to life. That afternoon, in the stuffy, smoke-filled back room of the Silver Spur Saloon, they gathered. The air was thick with the scent of stale beer and fresh resolve. There was Caleb, his presence a quiet anchor. Silas, his rifle leaned against the wall, a silent promise. Jedediah the blacksmith, his ham-like hands resting on the table. Martha, her lips a grim line, and a dozen or so others, the ordinary, overlooked backbone of Whisper Gulch. They sat around a scarred wooden table, illuminated by a single flickering oil lamp, its glow casting long dancing shadows on the walls. They were there to figure out what came next. There was no going back now. The line had been crossed, the challenge issued. The initial relief faded, replaced by a sober recognition of the danger ahead. "They won't let this go," Jedediah rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "They'll be back, and they'll be angrier." "We know that," Silas replied, his gaze steady. "The question is, are we ready for them?" A tense silence filled the room. This wasn't just about defending themselves. It was about reclaiming their town, their dignity. Caleb spoke then, his voice low, but every word carried weight. "We have to hit them where they don't expect it. They rely on fear. We break that, and they've got nothing." They spent hours planning, drawing crude diagrams in the dust on the tabletop, discussing positions, weapons, and signals. They talked about setting up defenses, about using the town's layout to their advantage. It wasn't about a fair fight. It was about survival, about outsmarting the predators who had preyed on them for too long. Ilara, though not in the saloon, was still a silent, powerful presence in their discussions. Her humiliation was the catalyst, the spark that had finally ignited their dormant courage. They came back 3 days later. The air, already thick with unspoken apprehension, vibrated with their approach. You could hear them long before you saw them. The ominous, ground-shaking pounding of hooves, a rumble that vibrated through the very foundations of the buildings, the metallic rattle of rifles slung across saddles, the coarse, boisterous shouts and curses of men confident in their overwhelming numbers. This time, it wasn't 2 men. It was more than 10, a grim, dust-shrouded procession, riding side by side down the main road, their formation tight, like they were rolling into enemy territory. They rode with a grim, purposeful intent, expecting no resistance, only the familiar cowering. But Whisper Gulch wasn't the same town they'd ridden through a week ago. The fear was still there, a cold knot in many stomachs, but it was now laced with a steely resolve, a desperate courage born of a refusal to endure further humiliation. Behind overturned wagons, repurposed as barricades and precarious stacks of crates, the townsfolk crouched in the shadows, their hearts pounding, their hands clutching their makeshift weapons. The blacksmith, Jedediah, his face smudged with soot, gripped his massive hammer like a relic of war. Old Martha, the store owner, held a double-barreled shotgun, its worn stock pressed against her shoulder, her jaw set. And even old Mrs. Harlow, her spectacles perched precariously on her nose, had a cast-iron skillet held aloft in her trembling but determined hand, like she meant serious business. They had learned from Caleb, from Silas, from each other. They had shed their fear, piece by painful piece, and armed themselves with a unity they hadn't known they possessed. As the gang slowed their horses in front of the Silver Spur Saloon, their leader, a hulking figure on a massive black horse, his face a mask of brutal anticipation, let out a triumphant roar. He expected to see empty streets, shuttered windows, a town already broken. Instead, he saw nothing. Just the silence. Then, a voice, high-pitched and surprisingly clear, rang out from somewhere on the rooftops. "Now!" Suddenly, as if by magic, bags of flour, precisely placed, burst open from the rooftops above, raining down in blinding, choking clouds of white dust. Half the riders, caught completely off guard, were instantly enveloped, their horses whinnying and rearing in confusion, their vision obscured. The rest, momentarily disoriented, tried to push forward, cursing and sputtering, but they were met not with empty air, but with a torrent of unexpected resistance. Barrels, once full of provisions, now filled with rocks and debris, were rolled into their path. Sticks, heavy and swung with desperate force, cracked against horse flanks, and more than once the sharp, decisive crack of a rifle, followed by the whistle of a bullet. One bullet, fired by Silas from a concealed position in the bakery's second-story window, found its mark, catching a rider squarely in the shoulder. The man cried out, a guttural shriek, and tumbled from his saddle, landing with a sickening thud in the dust. The rest of the gang froze, their bravado evaporating, realizing with a sudden chilling clarity that this wasn't just Caleb, the lonely rancher, standing in their way. No. This was the whole damn town. This wasn't a raid. It was an ambush. From every doorway and every narrow alley figures emerged, closing in like a tightening noose. Men and women, young and old, their faces hard with a newfound resolve, their hands steady on whatever weapon they possessed. The silence that followed the last rifle shot was thick with anticipation, and then everyone waited to see what Caleb, their quiet leader, would do next. Caleb stepped forward from the shadow of the blacksmith's forge, his figure silhouetted against the bright dust. He held Jedediah's largest hammer in his hand, its heavy head gleaming dully in the sunlight. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply brought the head of the hammer down against the packed earth once, a resounding thud that echoed through the street, a final, unyielding punctuation mark. "Come back here again," he said, his voice low, carrying easily through the sudden, absolute stillness, "and there won't be a way out." It wasn't shouted. It didn't have to be. The stillness in the street after that single, chilling sentence said it all. The gang leader, his face contorted in a sneer that couldn't quite hide the fear in his eyes, spat in the dust. He looked around at a town that wasn't afraid anymore, a town that had found its voice, its teeth, its unity. He saw the grim determination in Silas's eyes, the unwavering stance of Martha, the fierce resolve etched on every face. He saw the wounded man writhing on the ground, a stark reminder of the new risks. And he knew, with a sudden sinking certainty, that this was a fight he couldn't win. Not here, not today. He gave a sharp, curt signal to his remaining men to turn back. They rode out slower than they came in, their once swaggering pace now humbled, hesitant. Not daring to look over their shoulders, they retreated from Whisper Gulch, defeated not by a gunfight, but by the collective will of its people. Word later spread that they'd picked another town to bleed, one that hadn't yet found its backbone, a town still willing to cower. And just like that, Whisper Gulch was quiet again. Not the fearful kind of quiet, the oppressive silence of dread, but the profound, resonant quiet that comes when folks know they've stood their ground, when they have faced down their demons and emerged victorious. The gang was gone, their horses' hooves fading into the distance, carrying with them the last vestiges of fear and oppression. For a long, significant moment, no one moved. The dust settled, the sun continued its relentless beat, and the only sound was the wind, a gentle sigh of relief. Then slowly, cautiously, folks began to step out from behind the overturned barrels and the shadowed doorways, dusting off their clothes, looking at one another with expressions of dazed disbelief, then dawning pride. It was as if to say, with unspoken awe, We really did it." Ilara, her torn dress still wrapped in the rough blanket, walked slowly across the street toward Caleb. Her head was held high, a new, fierce light in her eyes. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him, her gaze soft but steady, filled with an unspoken gratitude that transcended words. He gave a small nod, a gesture of profound understanding, the kind that says more than words ever could. It was a shared moment, a silent acknowledgement of their intertwined courage and the future they had just forged together. In the days that followed, Whisper Gulch settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm of resilience and cautious optimism. Merchants kept their doors open, no longer looking nervously over their shoulders at every shadow. Kids played in the street again, their laughter ringing freely, a joyous sound that had been absent for too long. And Caleb, well, he still spent most of his days working his lonely ranch, the quiet vastness of the land a familiar comfort. But every morning, without fail, he found himself stopping by Ilara's bakery before heading out to the pastures. Sometimes it was for a loaf of her fresh-baked bread, its crusty exterior yielding to a soft, fragrant interior. Sometimes it was for a slice of her famous peach pie, sweet and comforting. And always, it was for the company. It wasn't some whirlwind romance, a passionate, fiery affair born of shared danger. It was something steadier, deeper, more profound. It was the quiet, enduring kind of connection that comes from two people who have both known profound loss, who have walked through the valley of shadows and emerged on the other side. They understood the quiet comfort of simply not being alone anymore, of having someone who understood the unspoken burdens, the silent battles. Folks in town noticed, of course, and they approved. After all, in a place like Whisper Gulch, you don't just survive on your own. You survive because you've got someone watching your back, someone to stand with you when the dust rises and the shadows lengthen. Perhaps that's the real lesson here. A town doesn't change because one man, no matter how brave, stands up. It changes when everyone together decides they're done living in fear. And sometimes the strength to stand up comes not from the person you expect to be a hero, but from the lonely rancher who's had enough, or the resilient widow who refuses to be broken. It comes from the quiet, persistent courage of people who simply refuse to give up on their home, on their dignity, on each other. And sometimes it comes from the person you've cared about, silently, all along. So here's my question to you. If you'd been there that day, standing in the dusty street of Whisper Gulch, watching the injustice unfold, would you have stepped out? Or would you have waited for someone else to go first? If you enjoyed riding through this story with me, if you felt the heat of the sun and the grit of the dust, give it a like. It helps more than you know. And if you want to hear more tales from the Old West, the kind that make you feel like you're standing right there in the heart of the action, hit that subscribe button. There's more to come, and trust me, you don't want to miss a single word.